Greetings to everyone. Welcome back once again to my educational channel called Learn Bio with Janet. I'm teacher Janet. I hope that you're all doing well. And today we'll be discussing the topic of inheritance for the Form 5 KSSM syllabus, subtopic 11.1, part 3. This is the third video on inheritance. Here we'll be discussing genetic questions. The first set of genetic questions, set A, and I will be giving you step-by-step explanation on how to draw schematic diagrams or genetic diagrams, which is important to help you do well in the exam. So this is my Score A+ in Biology series, and the questions here are all geared towards the exam format, all right, and also the trend, the SPM trend. So you can be sure that you are training yourself to answer questions that are very similar to the SPM questions. Okay, so you can consider the questions here to be something like forecast questions, right? So join me as we continue to discuss some interesting genetic questions in this series. First of all, here are the videos that have been produced so far on Chapter 11, Inheritance, subtopic 11.1. The first video was on Mendel's experiments and the drawing of the schematic diagram. In the second video, the genetic terms were explained. And in this video, the third video, we're going to discuss the first set of genetic questions. So in the next video, we'll be talking about Punnett square and Mendel's first law, and that will finish up the subtopic of 11.1. Then I will produce more videos on genetic questions to train you to answer these questions, this type of questions for SPM. Let us start off by discussing the objective questions. So all the questions here follow the SPM trends, and they are similar to the type of questions that you get in exams and in SPM. So the first question is, the figure shows a pair of homologous chromosomes. What do the letters big R and small r represent? A trait, B, alleles of the same gene, C, two types of genes, or D, phenotype. Think about this for a moment. Alright, so this diagram shows a pair of homologous chromosomes with the same structure and type of genes. And here we see the pink bands here, which represent segments of the chromosomes or segments of DNA that contains the units of inheritance, right? So big R is situated here, small r is situated here at the same position on the pair of homologous chromosomes. So what is the term that's used for the units that occupy the same locus on a pair of homologous chromosomes? Alleles, right? So B is the answer. Alleles of the same gene, right? Now, if we refer back to our definition of alleles, an allele is an alternative form of a gene that controls a specific trait. Okay? So these two alleles are different forms of the same gene. As we have said, let's say the gene for characteristic of height, right? It consists of two alternative forms, or in brackets, versions, all right? So, okay, so the two alternative forms of the gene for the characteristic of height are the alleles. So allele for tall stem, maybe R represents allele for tall stem, which is dominant, and small r may represent the allele for dwarf stem, which is recessive. Okay, so the right answer here is alleles. So these individual letters represent alleles of the same gene. So it's not two types of genes, only one gene is involved. which comprises two alternative forms or two alleles, right? So that's why it says an allele is an alternative form of a gene that controls a specific trait, a gene. Now, it's not a phenotype either because it's not the observable characteristic. It's more related to the genetic composition in the cell, right? Number 2, which of the following refers to the observable characteristics of an organism? A, phenotype, B, genotype, C, variance, and D, homozygote. Alright, so according to our definition again, the definitions that we have discussed in the second video, observable characteristics of an organism. The term that is defined as the observable characteristics of an organism is A, phenotype. Okay, so you must know your definitions well. And this means the traits that are expressed by an organism, that are shown by the organism. Alright, and that's the phenotype. As in contrast to the genotype, which is the genetic composition in a cell. Alright. So number 3, the diagram shows a pair of homologous chromosomes. What is big D, small d? Big D, small d. Is it A, phenotype, B, homozygote, C, genotype, or D, dominant trait? Right, so if we look at this diagram, it's again a pair of homologous chromosomes, and we see that D is the band on the chromosome or the segment of the chromosome. So it represents an allele, all right? So big D is an allele, a dominant allele, and small d is the recessive allele that controls a specific, that is of the same gene, and controls, this gene controls a specific characteristic, okay? So when we have a pair of alleles together like this, they represent the genetic composition or the genotype. C is the answer, okay? The genotype of the organism. If it's just one letter like this by itself, it's an allele. But when you have a pair of alleles together like this, this represents the genotype of an organism. Okay? So altogether, 3 marks. The total number of marks is 3 marks here. 1 mark for each objective question. Let us go on to question 4. An allele is A, an observable trait, B, the genotype of an organism, C, one of the possible forms of a gene, or D, a dominant gene that expresses itself. So recall the definition of an allele to answer this question. Alright, so the definition of an allele is that it is one of the alternate forms of a gene. And usually there are 2 alternate forms. Okay, like for example, gene for height in the pea plant consists of 2 alleles, 2 possible forms or 2 alleles. The allele for tall stem and the allele for dwarf stem. Alright, so the best answer here is that an allele is one of the possible forms of a gene. Okay, that's the best answer. So it's not an observable trait that we can see, right? It is not the genotype. Now, genotype usually is represented by 2 letters, and each letter stands for an allele, right? Okay, so this is not a genotype because we're just talking about the one allele by itself. And it is not a dominant gene, okay, that expresses itself. When you say an allele, it doesn't mean that it is a dominant allele. Okay, it could be a recessive allele also. Okay, so generally an allele is one of the possible forms of a gene. Answer is C. Going on to the last objective question. In pea plants, the allele for green pod is dominant to the allele for yellow pod. 2 heterozygous pea plants were crossed or are crossed. What is the probability of getting an offspring which has yellow pods? Okay, A 10%, B 25%, C 50%, D 75%. Now when you come to this kind of genetic question where a problem is presented to you, take out your highlighter or your pencil or pen to underline the facts so that you can extract the information first, okay, before you draw a simple schematic diagram to solve the problem and answer the question. Alright, so first we must find out what information is given here. Now, can highlight here. Alright, let me see whether I can highlight together with you right here. So we can highlight the allele for green pod. Okay, the pod is the fruit that contains the seed. So there's a green pod, dominant, I like this word, dominant, to allele for yellow pod, right? So our traits here are green pod and yellow pod. Alright, controlled by allele for green pod and allele for yellow pod. And the allele for green pod is dominant. Alright, that's the third point you must know, to the allele for yellow pod. Now, what plants are crossed? Two heterozygous plants crossed. What do you mean by heterozygous? It means that the plant has one dominant allele and one recessive allele in each of its cells, okay, for that particular for the traits that we are studying. Alright, there's one dominant allele, one recessive allele. Now, what is the probability of getting an offspring which has yellow pods? Okay, we're talking about yellow pods in the offspring. Now, is yellow pod a recessive or dominant trait? Okay, it is a recessive trait, okay, based on the first sentence here. Allele for green pod is dominant to allele for yellow pod, meaning that it means that green pod, the trait of green pod, having pods that are green color, is dominant to the trait for yellow pod. So yellow pod is a recessive trait, okay, whereas green pod is a dominant trait. Now, so that is the question, and now you have to draw a schematic diagram where you have to draw the genotype of the two heterozygous parent pea plants, and then do the cross by drawing the schematic diagram. Okay, so at this point, before I go on to the answer, you can pause the video and try to draw the diagram yourself based on the facts here. Just as a guideline, the first thing we need to do is to assign letters, okay, for the various alleles. For example, we know that in this cross, the allele for green pod and the allele for yellow pod are involved, right? So what letter can you assign to these alleles? Always follow the dominant allele as far as possible. So the dominant allele is the allele for green pod. So we can use the letter associated with the word green. Okay, we can use capital G. So let capital G be the allele for green pod and put in brackets dominant. So what is the allele for yellow pod? If the allele for green pod is capital G, what is the allele for yellow pod? It is the small g. So small g, let small g represent allele for yellow pod, brackets recessive. That is the key. So once you've written down your key, you can start drawing the diagram. You must be able to determine the parent's genotype, and after that, what is found in the gametes, and after that, fusion of gametes in fertilization to produce the offspring. Don't worry if this is your first time drawing the schematic diagram, as you'll be taught how to do it, so that as you keep practicing, you'll become better and better at answering these type of questions, right? So you can try drawing the diagram yourself first. Okay, write down genotype of parents, and then after that, gametes, meiosis, gametes, after gametes, fertilization. And then what is the genotype of the offspring? Okay, and then the phenotype. And from there, you calculate the percentage of offspring which have the yellow pods. Okay, to find the probability of getting offspring with yellow pods. Alright, so you can try doing it yourself, and I'm going to give you the solution in the next slide. So what is your answer for this question? Okay, let's see how to get the answer. First of all, the key. Write down the key. So let big G represent allele for green pod, and it is a dominant allele. Let small g represent allele for yellow pod. It is a recessive allele. So the parents. Okay, one plant will supply the male gametes and the other plant will supply the female gametes. Now, phenotype means the observable characteristic. Both plants produce green pods. All right, why green pods? Because their genotype is big G, small g. According to the question, both are heterozygous plants. So they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele each, all right, for their genotype. So because of the dominant allele big G, right, therefore the plant is able to produce green pods because dominant allele big G will express its trait in the presence of the recessive allele, right? And it suppresses the effect of the recessive allele, right? So the plant will have green pods. But this is not needed for this question, this information, okay? Without knowing the phenotype, you can still get the answer. Okay, next, meiosis occurs and homologous chromosomes separate during anaphase 1. So the alleles will also separate from each other. And this means that the gametes formed will have only one allele each in each of the gametes, right? So let big G separate from small g here. So 50% of the gametes will have the allele big G, 50% will have the allele small g, right? Same for this plant. Okay, separate the two alleles. Now, next, in fertilization, gametes fuse together. Gametes from the male plant, the one that supplies the male gametes, will fuse with the gametes from the other plant, right? So do it systematically. There are a few possibilities here. First gamete from first plant can fuse with the first gamete from second plant. Or first gamete from first plant fuses with the second gamete from first plant, from second plant. Okay, from second plant. Then the second gamete from first plant with the first gamete from second plant. And then second with second. Okay? So in other words, first with first, first with second. Then second with first, second with second. Alright? So what are the genotypes of the offspring? So first with first gamete with first gamete, you get these two dominant alleles coming together, okay, in the same cell, in the zygote. So the offspring form will have the genotype big G, big G. Now, first with second, so big G and small g comes together in the same cell when these two gametes fuse together in fertilization. Big G, small g. Okay, always write the big G first, before the small g. The dominant allele, write the dominant allele first, then the recessive allele. Now, small g and big G comes together. Okay, in the third possible combination. So, again, it's big G, small g. And lastly, second gamete with second gamete. So we get small g, right? Okay, so write all your, all the genotypes on the same horizontal line as the title here. All right. Now, next from the genotype, we determine the phenotype. So if you look at these three plants here, the offspring, looking at the genotype, we see that each one has a dominant allele, big G, okay, allele for green pod. Therefore, these plants produce green pods because the dominant allele, big G, will express its trait in the presence of the recessive allele too, right? It will express its trait. And then the last one here is a homozygous recessive plant with the genotype small g. So without the big G allele present, it's able to express its trait, and that is, it produces yellow pods. Okay? Thus, the probability of getting an offspring with yellow pods is, now here the probability is expressed as a percentage. Sometimes it's expressed as a fraction. So if it's a fraction, it will be 1 out of a total of 4 plants have yellow pods. It will be 1/4. But since you need to write it as a percentage, you have to times by 100. So you get 25%. So B is the answer. Okay, B is the answer. 25%, B. So this working or this solution, you can just write it on a piece of paper and then find the answer and then mark the answer. Okay, write down the answer. Now lastly is a structured or essay question. Can be asked in the structured question section or essay section. Alright, so it's a SPM forecast question for monohybrid inheritance. Okay, question 6. The allele for black fur in a rat is dominant to the allele for white fur. A heterozygous black male rat is mated with a white female rat. Now A. Draw a schematic diagram to show the cross. B. What is the estimated phenotypic ratio of rats with black fur to rats with white fur among the offspring? And lastly, explain why the heterozygous male rat, parent rat, is black, right? Okay, so firstly, as usual, we have to extract the information, right? So let's highlight the information that's important. Allele for black fur, okay, dominant to allele for white fur. Now we're talking about rats, not plants already. Then heterozygous black male rat mated with white female rat. And we are supposed to draw a schematic diagram to show this. Cross. Okay. After we draw it, we have to find the phenotypic ratio of rats with black fur to rats with white fur. Okay, in the offspring. Ratio of rats with black fur to rats with white fur. And next, the last part, why is the heterozygous male rat mentioned here, black and not white? Okay. Alright, so again, as for the previous question, we have to find out what are the two alleles involved, right? After that, we have to assign letters to represent the alleles. Okay, so we'll discuss this here, and then after that, you can draw your own schematic diagram first, and then we will compare your answer with the one that's given. Okay, and see how marks can be given. Now, so what's the information that we can get here? Allele for black fur dominant to allele for white fur, right? So you have to assign letters for the alleles. So these are the two alleles, or the traits are black fur and white fur. So assign letters for the alleles. What letter are you going to use to represent the dominant allele, which is the allele for black fur? Now, as usual, try to get the same letter as the name or the trait that is dominant. So we can we use B? Okay, try to follow the name for the trait that is dominant, not the recessive trait. So black fur. So use capital B, right, to represent allele for black fur. Then if you use capital B to represent allele for black fur, then what are you going to use to represent allele for white fur? Yes, the small b. So you have your key, you can write your key at the side already. Big B equals to allele for black fur, dominant, correct? And small b equals to allele for white fur, bracket, recessive. Okay? Alright, then you can determine, try to determine for yourself what the genotypes are for the heterozygous black male rat and the white female rat. Okay, so that you can draw the schematic diagram to show the cross. Alright, so if you like to try this on your own, you should try it on your own first. You can pause the video and then you can try and think about this. What are the genotypes of the parents involved in the cross, and draw the schematic diagram, like what we did for the pea plant in the previous question. Okay? So I'll leave you to do the question first, and then in the next slide, we're going to see the answer. And we are going to find out how to mark it. Right, so here are some tips on how to answer genetic questions or problems like this, like question 6, all right? So we have to determine the following aspects from the question. All right, this is the same question that we discussed just now. Now, what is the characteristic that we are studying here? It's fur color. Secondly, what are the two traits that are mentioned? It's black fur and white fur. Thirdly, which trait or allele is dominant? As stated, it is the allele for black fur that is dominant to the allele for white fur. Then assign letters to represent the alleles and write down the key. So we have already assigned the letters. Let big B represent allele for black fur trait, which is dominant, and small b to represent allele for white fur trait, which is recessive. Okay. Now sometimes in the exam, they have already assigned the letters for you. Then you just follow what letters they assign. But if there's no, they didn't assign any letters or choose any letters to represent the alleles, then you can choose it yourself, right? So this is what you need to write in the key for the essay answer or the structured question answer. You have to write down a key. If there's no key, then your schematic diagram will not make any sense. Okay, so the key is very important to write down. So you remember that the big B represents allele for black fur trait, not allele. Some students make the mistake of writing let big B represent black fur. That's not correct. Okay, it's an allele. Okay, a unit of inheritance that determines this trait. And small b is the allele for white fur. Now the word trait, if you don't write it in, it's okay. Allele for black fur, allele for white fur. Right? Now after that, you have to determine the genotypes of the parents. Okay? So based on what is stated here, determine the genotype of the male rat and the female rat. Okay? Now it's very clear here that the male rat is a heterozygous male rat. So it must have what? What is the genotype for a heterozygous rat in this case? By using the letters big B and small b. So the rat will have a pair of alleles, these alleles, in each of its diploid cells. So what is the genotype or the genetic content of the male rat? Yes, it is big B, small b. And then for the female rat, it is white in color. So white, is it a dominant trait or a recessive trait? White fur. It is a recessive trait, right? So if the white rat is able to express the recessive trait, it means that it must be homozygous recessive, having two recessive alleles. That is small b, small b. So the female rat which has a recessive trait has only one possible genotype, which is homozygous recessive, or small b. The genotype should be small b, small b. So remember this rule when determining genotypes. The genotype of an organism with a recessive trait is always homozygous recessive, having two recessive alleles, like small b for the white rat. Okay, so once you determine the genotypes of the parents, you can start drawing your schematic diagram. Okay, so remember this golden rule for the genotype of an organism with a recessive trait. So apart from writing your key, right, another thing you must remember to write are the titles on the left hand side. So without these titles, the drawing, the schematic diagram will make no sense. Now in the first video, we have already drawn one schematic diagram to explain Mendel's experiment on the characteristic of height in pea plant. Okay, so the titles according to the right order are parent, phenotype, genotype, meiosis, gametes, fertilization, genotype of offspring, and phenotype of offspring. Okay, now how do you remember so many items? So I gave you a memory aid in the first video. At the end of the first video, we can call it a mnemonic, which is a sentence that reminds us what the various items should be. All right, the various words, what the various words should be. So the mnemonic or the memory aid here, okay, which is my BioKeys memory aid, is Papa, please get me Galaxy handphone for growing oranges plus onions, right? Just remember, get me Galaxy, the handphone is not included. So get me Galaxy for growing oranges plus onions. Where the first letter of each word in our mnemonic or memory aid stands for the first letter of each of the titles. Okay, so P for parent, the next P is for phenotype, G is for genotype, meiosis, M for meiosis, so meiosis, G for gametes, F for fertilization, G for genotype, O for offspring, plus P for phenotype, and O for offspring. Okay, so if you memorize this memory aid, then it will help you to remember the titles better, in case you have to write it out for your essay answer or even for structured question answer. All right, sometimes in the structured question the titles will be given, sometimes they are not. All right, so you can use this BioKeys memory aid to help you. So you can get started on drawing your genetic diagram, and here again is the question which was stated in previously just now. So you can draw the diagram, think about the question that's stated here, and then try and draw the diagram accordingly, right? And then in the next slide we are going to see the answer. So you can pause at this point and try to draw a diagram by yourself first. Right, let us look at the answer for question 6. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is to have a key. Let big B be the allele for black fur, dominant, small b be the allele for white fur, recessive. So with the key, you may get 1 mark. Now sometimes in the question, the key or the letters are already assigned for the various alleles. So if it is so, you just follow the question and use the letters provided for you, okay, to represent the alleles. Next, let's look at our schematic diagram. So we have to write down the titles and then write down the contents here. Now parents are the male rat and the female rat. A phenotype means the observable characteristic, so black for male, white for female, according to the question. Genotype, as we have discussed just now, is a heterozygous black male rat. So this genotype consists of 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele, because the male rat is heterozygous, meaning having 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. For the female rat, because it shows the recessive trait, it must be homozygous recessive, having 2 identical recessive alleles, small b, small b. Then meiosis occurs, so draw the arrows showing meiosis, and then gametes are formed. So in the formation of gametes, as the homologous chromosomes separate from each other during meiosis and move to opposite poles during anaphase 1, so the alleles too will separate. Now they'll be carried by the homologous chromosomes to the separate poles, 2 different poles. So each gamete has only 1 allele. All right, separate these 2 alleles from each other. So big B goes to one type of gamete and the small b to the other type of gamete. So 50% of the gametes in the male rat contain the allele big B. 50% of the gametes contain the allele small b. Okay, now for the female rat, small b separates from small b, so all the gametes will have the small b allele, okay, or allele for white fur. But don't just draw one, draw 2 to make it more complete, right? Just separate these 2. If you are going by the shortcut method for objective questions, you can just draw 1, okay, but more about that later. So anyway, now just draw 2 of it in your diagram, small b, small b. Fertilization occurs after that, where gametes fuse together and form the zygote, and the zygote will form the offspring, okay? So the zygote is the offspring, okay, it will develop into the offspring. So what are the genotypes of the offsprings? Okay, there are 4 possibilities here. For example, first gamete from male rat can fuse with first gamete from female rat, right? So draw the lines, and here we see big B and small b comes together in the zygote. So this offspring will have the genotype big B, small b. Okay, big B, small b. Second possibility is first gamete here fuses with second gamete from the other parent. Okay, so draw the lines to show the fusion. Again, the result is a genotype that's similar to the first one, big B, small b. Okay, big B, small b. Third possibility is that the second gamete fuses with the first gamete from the other parent. Okay, the result is a genotype that is big B, small b, small b, small b, small b. And the fourth one is second gamete with second gamete. Small b too. Okay, so the genotype will determine the phenotype. So what are the phenotypes of the offspring? Now, as long as they have the offspring has a big B allele, it will have black fur. Okay, because big B allele is dominant. The allele for black fur is dominant. And actually, this genotype, this offspring is similar to the male parent in terms of its genotype. Whereas these two offspring have the same genotype as the female parent. Okay, small b, small b. So these two have white fur. Okay, because they don't have any dominant alleles for black fur in their genotypes. Okay, so this is just homozygous recessive organism. So it will have the recessive trait of white fur. Now next, what is the phenotypic ratio? So here we can bracket these two up and put 2 black fur to 2 white fur. Okay, so it is 2 black is to 2 white, and to simplify it becomes 1 black, 1 white. So your phenotypic ratio is 1 black, 1 white. Right, that's the answer. Now how about the marking? So going up here, we can mark this genotype. If the answer here shows the genotype big B, small b, small b, small b in the same horizontal line, then the student will get 1 mark. Now secondly, if you have written the gametes here correctly in the same horizontal line, gametes big B, small b, small b, small b, you get 1 mark. And then if you've written meiosis and fertilization, maybe this is equivalent to 1 mark for the processes. All right. Next, the genotype of the offspring, again in one horizontal line, big B, small b, big B, small b, small b, small b, small b, small b, all the b's. So 1 mark here. And finally, for the phenotype of the offspring, we must bracket up and show which one is black, has black fur, which one has white fur. All right, and write the numbers down. So 1 mark. Phenotypic ratio, if you show the working and the final result is 1 mark. So altogether here, there are 6 marks plus this one, 7 marks. So maybe any 6 points will get you the maximum marks of 6 marks. Finally, the last question. Explain why the heterozygous male rat, the parent rat, is black and not white. Okay, so this has something to do with the dominant allele, the definition for dominant allele. So the allele that controls the trait of black fur is dominant to the allele for white fur. Okay, so allele for black fur is dominant to the allele for white fur. Now this is already mentioned at the beginning of the question, so you may not get marks for that. Okay, so you have to elaborate on what is meant by dominant. All right, so it means that in a heterozygous rat, that means the black rat which is heterozygous, which has genotype big B, small b, right, the allele for black fur is able to express its trait because it's dominant. And at the same time, it suppresses the effect of the recessive allele for white fur, which cannot express its trait of white fur. Okay, so although this heterozygous rat has the genotype big B, small b, only the allele big B is able to express its trait. Okay, and the dominant allele will suppress the effect of the recessive allele, which is small b, the allele for white fur. So no white fur will be produced, right? Only the black fur. Okay, so 1 mark for heterozygous rat, which has genotype big B, small b, and the allele for black fur is able to express its traits, and then the dominant allele for black fur suppresses the effect of the recessive allele. Okay, so these are all the key points.